Alright, ladies and gentlemen, today we're finally making the most requested update video for this channel, which is what if current Luffy was at Marineford. And by current Luffy, I mean the current one in the manga, so there's your spoiler warning. But yes, we're talking about the Luffy that just defeated Kaido, the one that just awakened his mythical Zoan with Gear 5th, and the one with sky-splitting Advance Conquers Haki. What would happen if he was at Marineford? How does he stack up against the Admirals and everybody else? How does the scenario change? We're gonna talk about that today. But before we get into that, I just need you to do me one favor, which is to hit that subscribe button and join a King Pirates crew, because it really helps the channel and I would really appreciate it. With that being said though, let's get into this discussion. The first thing I want to do is lay some ground rules, and I know some people are just going to completely skip this part and comment some things that completely ignore the rules, but for those of you that watch this, I really appreciate it. But yeah, the main reason I want to establish some ground rules is because this is a what if scenario, and if we have too many variables, things just become impossible to even predict or really talk about. So yeah, how this is gonna go is pretty much the same as last time. We are taking the current Luffy with all of his knowledge and all of his powers and replacing him with the Luffy at Marineford. I did think about whether or not Luffy should have his current knowledge because that might affect things, but at the end of the day, Luffy is still Luffy. He's more matured and he knows some more things, but at the end of the day, he's still the same reckless Luffy and just does whatever he wants. Plus, it wouldn't really make sense if he was the same Luffy knowledge-wise, because the guy literally knows how to use Advance Conquers Haki, and Luffy at Marineford didn't even know he had Conquers Haki. So we're giving Luffy his current powers and current knowledge, but there is one thing I want to change, which is removing the experience he had when he was at Marineford. Because if he goes back into that scenario knowing exactly what's going to happen, that's going to be just too easy for him. The guy already has future sight. He doesn't need to know the entire scenario of what's going to happen. So essentially, we're just cutting the Marineford story arc out of Luffy's memory and giving him a void sentry there. But that's not going to be the only thing Luffy's going to be missing. The Straw Hats are also not going to be in this scenario. I want to keep the scenario as contained as it could be. The Straw Hats weren't there the first time, so they're not going to be here this time around either. Plus, if the Straw Hats were also there, this video will probably end very quickly. But besides that, the last thing I want to talk about is how Luffy gets into the scenario. And essentially, all I'm doing is replacing the past Luffy with the current version of himself at Marineford. So we're not placing the current Luffy as Sabaody or Amazon Lily or Impel Down, because if that were the case, Marineford probably wouldn't happen. And we're not going to have him like go individually to Marineford. He's going to show up the exact same way he did the first time, just as his current self. And that right there is the ground rules. Is pretty much Luffy's second chance to save Ace as his current self by himself. So with that said, let's actually get into this discussion, and I want to start with power scaling, which is going to be the most toxic part, but it's also low-key the most fun. So for this section, we're going to be talking about where current Luffy would rank amongst the people at Marineford, and this is where I'm really glad that I waited to make this update video, because not only do we understand Luffy's powers better now, but also the last chapter we got before the break, it has some pretty interesting stuff that sparked some debates. And that, of course, was the Menace Green Bull showing up to Wano and just demolishing King and Queen and dropping a banger of a one-liner where he essentially said Yonko commanders are bugs. And as a result, the whole Yonko versus Admiral debate sparked back up, which is pretty relevant to what we're about to talk about. But honestly, for me, as cool as that Green Bull scene was, it doesn't really change my opinion on anything. First off, my belief on this debate was always the Yonko are stronger than the Admirals, but the space between them is very minimal. And that part is important because when you compare the Yonko to other people like the Yonko commanders, there's still clearly a very big gap. And in relation to that, I do believe the Admirals are a pretty big step above the Yonko commanders, so the scene with Green Bull doesn't really surprise me. And realistically, as far as the scene itself, Green Bull didn't really do anything. 7 days had passed, so King and Queen had definitely recovered by then, but there was no way in hell that they weren't cuffed by Sea Stones, because the Straw Hats are not leaving Babanuki to watch over King and Queen. So as cool as that scene was, I didn't take it as Green Bull taking down King and Queen by himself. But yeah, getting back onto topic, as far as where the Admirals rank, I see them below the Yonko, but they're still in that elite tier where I call the Elite 12, where once you enter that range, you don't think you're gonna lose to anybody, and the gap between all of them is very small. And also on top of that, I do think there are special cases like the Fleet Admirals of Sengoku and the current Akainu, and also Garp. They could be just as strong, if not stronger, than some of the Yonko. So with that said, let's talk about how this applies to the current scenario of where Luffy ranks amongst the people at Marineford. He's grown in so many different ways in this fight against Kaido, which is why we're already making a second video to this scenario. But I do still fully believe that this is not the peak version of Luffy that we're gonna see, because first off, he did just learn a lot of these things. I think he needs more time to really understand his powers, especially Awakening, to really fully control it and use it to his potential. But also story-wise, there's still several other people that Luffy has to defeat, defeat like Blackbeard, probably a Kainu, and maybe even Emu. And if this is already the peak version of Luffy, he's not really gonna struggle in those fights, and he's not gonna have anywhere to progress and improve, and that's gonna make those fights uninteresting and boring. So even with how strong Luffy has become, I don't think he's the best version of himself, and I don't think he's just gonna blow everybody out the water at Marineford. At the same time, he is currently a legit Yonko, and I think with his current power, he will be stronger than all of the admirals at Marineford. But like I mentioned earlier, I don't think the gap is very big. Like if two of them team up against Luffy, Luffy will lose. I'm sure some people in the comments will even make an argument that a Kainu pre-time skip is stronger than the current Luffy. And while I think you might be able to make the argument for the current Akainu and post-time skip, pre-time skip Akainu I don't think is stacking up to the current Luffy. So as far as the three admirals go, I think they're going to be below Luffy. Obviously the Yonko commanders are also going to be all weaker than Luffy. And another person I think might be weaker than the current Luffy is Whitebeard at Marineford. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to disrespect Whitebeard. I think prime Whitebeard, he's definitely top 3 all time, and he might not be 3 or 2. But Whitebeard at Marineford, even though he was an absolute monster, he was like 73 years old. He was sick. The guy had IV drips hooked up all across his body. So considering his sickness and age, I think I might have to put him just slightly below the current Luffy. So with that said, I think most of the strong people that we saw take action at Marineford are going to be weaker than the current Luffy. But I do think there were a few people that we didn't really get to see in action at Marineford that might be just as strong, if not stronger than the current Luffy. And the 4 people I'm thinking about are Garp, Sengoku, Mihawk, and Shanks. As far as Sengoku and Garp goes, you might say, hey, they were also old, but it seemed like they were not like sick like Whitebeard. Sengoku in particular, I don't think we should sleep on him. The guy still had a full head of black hair. So on the Marine side, I think the 2 people Luffy has to worry about the most are Garp and Sengoku. On the other hand, we also have Shanks and Mihawk, who are just 2 people that are incredibly hard to judge. I see both of them in that elite top tier where they can stack up against anybody, but we also haven't really seen either of them in action and heard many stories about them and who they fought. And even if you just think in terms of story progression, which I often do, because Shanks and Mihawk are not like villains that Luffy has to defeat in the future, they don't really have a reason to be stronger than the current Luffy. But it's also entirely possible that they are stronger than the current Luffy because they are 2 massively huge characters. So honestly, they're probably 2 of the biggest wild cards of this whole scenario, but at the very least, they're gonna be near the top. But to wrap up this section, I'm gonna give my ranking of everybody at Marineford. If I had to choose, I would probably go Garp, Sengoku, Luffy, Whitebeard, Shanks, Mihawk, Blackbeard, maybe the admirals above Blackbeard, and then the Yonko commanders after that. I fully expect a lot of people to disagree. I don't really feel that confident in this ranking. I think a lot of these people are incredibly close, but if you do disagree and want to drop your thoughts in the comments, at least give me a reason for your rankings. Don't just like say,
oh, this sucks, you don't even know what you're talking about, Shanks is the GOAT.
Like if you're gonna debate me back, at least back up your reasoning. But now we get to the moment of truth. It's time to break down the actual scenario and how it's gonna go down. And the first thing we actually have to talk about is what actually happens before Luffy even gets there. Because remember, Luffy doesn't just show up right there in the beginning. He shows up like a little later into the war, which means everything that happens before Luffy gets there still happens. We get a good portion of the Whitebeard pirates versus the Marines, some Yonko commanders versus admirals, Little Oris Jr. near his death. There's a few things happening tactically as well. Aokiji ends up freezing the waters over, stranding the Whitebeard pirates. But then of course this is where Luffy makes his entrance. He falls out of the sky with his gang, and from that point on, it's a completely different story. Now ideally for Luffy, what happens here is that we get that iconic scene of Luffy standing next to Whitebeard, and they actually talk it out and make a plan. But like I mentioned earlier, the current Luffy is still Luffy. He's not gonna make a plan. He's just gonna charge straight ahead and try to save Ace. So instead, what we're really gonna be talking about is how everyone else is going to react. Because as far as Luffy goes, I think right away he's going into at least Gear 4th Bound Man and just dashing right to Ace. I don't think that will be enough to free Ace. I think Garp and Sengoku probably react and stop him. But just imagining a scene like that is just so dope. Like just imagine Luffy falls out of the sky, stands right next to Whitebeard, and he just charges ahead. Any Marines come by, conquers Haki, knocked out, goes into Gear 4th Bound Man, dashes right up to Sengoku, they conquers Haki, clash. Maybe they end up splitting the skies, who knows, but the reaction from everybody else, that would just be amazing to see. That right there would be like the announcement of this is a different scenario, and from that point on, everything changes. I think strategically, a lot of the little things that were done is not really gonna matter, and it's gonna come down to the top dogs. I think Whitebeard is gonna recognize Luffy's strength right away and just put all his manpower into supporting him. And of course, on the other hand, the admirals are not gonna mess around. They're gonna go right after Luffy. So I expect immediately the admirals and the Yonko commanders to engage in battle surrounding Luffy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we did see some of these battles before Luffy showed up, like Jozu versus Aokiji and Kizaru versus Marco. That scenario scenario was totally different. They were still feeling each other out, really trying to employ their tactics. In this scenario, nobody's going to be messing around. And if the admirals are taking things seriously, I don't think the Yonko commanders are going to be able to stack up to them. So what we really have to think about here is what matchups do we end up seeing and which side ends up winning those matchups. And honestly, even with the current Luffy at Marineford, I'm still not quite sure if the Whitebeard pirates have enough manpower. Because let's say you send Jozu and Vista up to Aokiji to really hold them down and push them back. You still have 2 more admirals remaining. Maybe Whitebeard takes action and he matches up against Akainu. I know some people are going to hear that and say that Akainu gets bodied, but I'm guessing that you didn't read Marineford. And I specifically said read because if you just watch Marineford, I totally understand why you would say Whitebeard decimates and bodies Akainu. Because in the anime, he just put Akainu into the ground and Akainu couldn't recover for like 5 or 6 episodes. In the manga though, not only did Akainu fight back and took off half of Whitebeard's face, but he also got back up in like 2 chapters. So even though I think Whitebeard's still gonna have the upper hand in that battle because he's not injured, Akainu's still gonna be able to hold his own and Whitebeard's not gonna be able to go anywhere else. And then after that, you still have Kizaru, who Marco could like hold on his own for a while, but I feel like that fight might be the one that gives out first. But what's even gonna be more important is who is fighting Luffy, which immediately I think Sengoku's gonna take action and both of them are gonna have an extreme div fight. But then this is where one of the wild cards come in, and that is Garp. Because if Garp ends up taking action, that completely shifts the balance. Right now across the board in all of these matchups, I think there's slight advantages on both sides, but it's all gonna be a prolonged battle. But if Garp actually ends up stepping into one of these battles, the alliance does not have anybody else to really make it even. So the question becomes, how exactly does he take action? Does he get serious like we saw at times during Marineford, or does he hold back against like Luffy, which we also saw? And personally, if I had to guess, I do think Garp ends up taking action because the situation is that desperate. Because even though across the board the matchups are pretty even, Luffy just needs one chance to go and free Ace, and that's all he needs to do. The Whitebeard pirates are not trying to defeat the Marines, they're just trying to free Ace. So the Garp in this scenario is not going to be able to just sit around. At the very least, I expect Sengoku to be like, Garp, we need you to act. And even if Sengoku doesn't do that, I feel like Garp, because of his pride as a Marine, at the very least, he's going to fight one of the Yonko commanders. And of course, by doing that, he completely shifts the balance. Maybe one of the admirals will now be free to go also fight Luffy. And that's actually not the only thing Luffy has to worry about, because there's also the warlords. And here's where we have more wild cards, because while we're gonna get the same battles that we saw, like Ivankov versus Kuma and Jinbei versus Moria, you still have a few more people that didn't really take much action in the original war. And the 2 people that could end up helping the Marines are Doflamingo and Mihawk. And then of course you still have Boa Hancock, who could end up helping Luffy. So now we have to talk about how these 3 are gonna take action. Like for example, Mihawk at the beginning of the war said he wanted to measure the distance between him and Whitebeard. During Marineford, he actually didn't end up doing anything, but maybe in this desperate situation, he has to take more action for the Marines, and he ends up going to fight Whitebeard. Doflamingo, I think, ends up taking more action as well, because at the end of the day, he's not gonna want to lose his warlord status. And that same thing is gonna apply to Boa, because as much as she's gonna want to help Luffy, she's probably still thinking about her country and not losing the status. I do think in the end, because of how much things are shifting towards the Marines, Boa will end up taking action and fighting somebody. But now all of a sudden, when you're looking at the matchups across the boards, things are really shifting towards the Marines. With Garp, Mihawk, and Doflamingo all taking action to some degree, the Whitebeard pirates just don't have enough manpower. So after that, it really becomes a question of how long the Whitebeard pirates could hold out. How much damage is done to the Whitebeard pirates and Whitebeard? Does Whitebeard still get stabbed by Squard? Things will really come down to how long the Whitebeard pirates can hold on for, because the Marines, really, they just need one big defeat. Like for example, if they put all their focus on Luffy or Whitebeard, or maybe even Marco, if they manage to kill one of those characters, the morale across the board on Whitebeard's side is just gonna dissipate. On the other hand though, if the Whitebeard pirates and Luffy could hold out without any casualties, that's a game changer. Because after that, Blackbeard is gonna end up showing up and causing a bunch of mayhem, and the Whitebeard pirates are probably gonna struggle a bit more, but all of a sudden the Marines have to worry about themselves as well. But most importantly, I think if the Whitebeard pirates and Luffy are able to hold out until Shanks and the red hair pirates showed up, then that's a different story. Because now I think they can actually win. Shanks is another Yonko. He has a whole crew of just absolute monsters. The Marines probably end up losing more manpower as well. Mihawk's agenda changes. He's not gonna fight Shanks. Doflamingo might take this opportunity to withdraw as well. So if Luffy and the Whitebeard pirates manage to hold out until Shanks show up, I do think they end up saving Ace. And that right there is the deciding factor of the whole battle. How much can current Luffy, Whitebeard, and his commanders hold out against Garp, Sengoku, the admirals, and the warlords? If I had to pick, I think in the end they probably still hold out. Whitebeard came with a mission to really sacrifice himself, so in the end, he might still end up dying, but maybe his sacrifice will be enough for Shanks to show up and to save Ace. But that's it for this video. If you watched this far, you probably enjoyed it, so please drop a like for me. But if you don't want to make it easy, let's play a quick game of rock, paper, scissors. If you lose, you have to like, subscribe, and watch the next video. Rock, paper, scissors, shoot!